Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar on tracking progress on nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation in national adaptation plan processes. My name is Christian Ledwell, and I'm the Knowledge Manager with the NAP Global Network Secretariat, and I'll be co-moderating today's session with my colleague, Nicole Jean.
Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole, and I'm a policy analyst with the NAP Global Network. Thank you for joining us today. To get us started, there's a few housekeeping details that I'd just like to go over. So first, today's session will be 60 minutes long, including a Q&A section at the end. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself by typing your name and affiliation in the chat box. We will be recording this session and we'll share the video and slides with participants as a follow-up. And simultaneous translation into French and Spanish is available today. If you have any questions, comments, or technical issues, please let us know in the chat box, and our colleague Adrian will be glad to assist you.
And in case this is your first time joining one of our webinars, the NAP Global Network is an initiative that was created in 2014 to support developing countries in advancing their national adaptation plan processes and help accelerate adaptation efforts around the world. To achieve this, the network facilitates South-South peer learning and exchange, supports national level action on NAP processes, and we aim to generate, synthesize, and share knowledge on effective and inclusive national adaptation planning.
We have an exciting panel of speakers today that will be speaking on integrating ecosystem considerations and nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation measures into NAP processes. We'll be hearing from three speakers. Jeffrey Key is a policy advisor with the NAP Global Network Secretariat and one of the authors of our recent publication tracking the progress of the integration of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation in NAP processes. Next, we'll hear from Andrea Greenwich, Senior Blue Economy Officer at Belize's Ministry of Blue Economy and Risk Management. She will be sharing the Belize government's experience with integrating ecosystem-based adaptation in the NAP for the country's coastal zone and fisheries sector. And last but not least, we'll hear from Lou Purps, National Adaptation Planning Officer at the United Nations Environment Program. She'll be sharing UNEP's work on supporting EBA in NAP processes, as well as an exciting new online course on EBA in NAPs. So before we dive into the presentations, we've prepared a short quiz with 2 questions on the trends we observed in our analysis of the integration of nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation in NAP processes. You will see the question pop up in your Zoom right now. And so the first question is, which of the following terms was mentioned the most in NAPs? Nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, ecosystem management, or ecosystem-based approaches? And then the second question is, which type of ecosystem was most commonly identified as vulnerable in the climate risk assessment chapters of NAPs? And are those agricultural, coastal and marine, forest, or wetlands? So hopefully everyone has had a chance to take their guesses now, and shortly you'll be able to see the answers to the quiz questions. So I'm not sure exactly when it'll show up, probably right now, but the answer to the first question, um, Which of the following terms was mentioned the most in NAPS? It is B, ecosystem-based adaptation, which was mentioned in 39 of the 57 NAPS reviewed. And then for the second question, which type of ecosystem was most commonly identified as vulnerable in the climate risk assessment chapters of NAPS? That is C, forests. So forest ecosystems were identified as vulnerable in 44 out of 57 NAPS.
Thanks very much, Nicole. So now we're going to hear from Jeffrey Key to dive into these findings and tell us a bit more about what they mean. Jeffrey, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Christian. And good morning from Vancouver, British Columbia. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar and learn more about countries' progress of integrating nature-based solutions in their NAP processes. My name is Jeffrey Chi. I'm a policy advisor with IISD and the NAP Global Network Secretariat. I split my time between research on nature-based solutions and our work on the Paris Agreement negotiations and negotiations under the Convention on Biological Diversity. My colleagues Annika Turton and Nicole Zhang, who is the moderator here today, and I co-authored this report, and that was published right before COP29 in Baku last year. And I'm very happy to have this opportunity to go over some of the key highlights from this report. Next slide, please. So let's maybe start with some history. Back in 2020, the NAP Global Network conducted its first review of ecosystem-based adaptation in NAP documents. And back then, there were only 19 NAP documents being submitted by developing countries to the UNFCCC. So our sample size was quite small just 5 years ago. By the time when we did this research for this report in July 2024 last year, we had 57 developing countries submitting their NAP documents to NAP Central. And you know, just a couple months later today, the number is even higher, which really speaks to the progress countries are making on their NAP processes. But we had to have a cutoff for our review, so we set the cutoff for July 2024. What we really wanted to do was to provide an update to that 2020 research. Now we have a bigger sample size and have an understanding as to what extent countries have integrated nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptations in their NAP documents, and to see what sort of trends or gaps there are and what's next for nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based adaptation in countries' NAP processes. Next slide, please. So before we get into the details, I just want to quickly go through the two key terms you'll hear a lot from me today. And we made a point to include them both in our reports. The first is ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA. It's the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall adaptation strategy. All ecosystem-based adaptation measures are nature-based solutions, but not all nature-based solutions are EBA. Nature-based solutions, or NBS, broadly refers to any action to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified ecosystems, which addresses social, economic, and environmental challenges, while providing multiple benefits, whether it is benefits for human well-being or benefiting ecosystems. So nature-based solutions is the broader umbrella term, while EBA refers to nature-based solutions that specifically help people and ecosystems adapt to the impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to go too deeply into our methodology. You still got to go to read our actual report to learn more about how we did what we did. But in short, we reviewed 57 NAP documents that were submitted before the end of July last year. We specifically looked for references to ecosystem-based adaptation, to nature-based solutions, to anything related to ecosystem or biodiversity in those NAP documents. We also looked for specific EBA measures, such as mangrove restoration, protected areas, watershed management, or different climate-smart agricultural practices. All in all, there was a lot of Control F findings happening last summer for the author team. Next slide, please. So what are some of the highlights from this report? 44 out of 57 NAP documents mention EBA or MBS, while EBA being the more prominent one in NAP documents. So that's 77% of NAPs that mention one of these terms. And as Nicole has just mentioned before, uh, sorry about that. And Nicole just mentioned before doing a little quiz, ecosystem-based adaptation was mentioned in 39 out of the 57 NAPs we reviewed. And you can see in the graphs here on the right that there was an uptick in 2020 and 2021, but that's mainly because many NAP documents were actually submitted during those 2 years. But what we did notice is that NAP documents that were submitted more recently have a higher likelihood of mentioning nature-based solutions than ecosystem-based adaptation. This could very well be because of the popularity of the term after the 2019 Climate Action Summit in New York, or the publication of IUCN's Global Standard on Nature-Based Solutions. Just some guesses from my end. At the same time, there are still countries that use ecosystem management or ecosystem-based approaches, these two terms. But what we found is that countries use these other terms usually also mention MBS or EBA as well. Another one here is that 3/4 of the NAP documents that we reviewed provide information and data about the climate risks and vulnerabilities facing their ecosystems as part of their overall climate risk and vulnerability assessments. That's an important metric that we pay close attention to because climate risk and vulnerability assessments underpins a country's adaptation planning process. And it is a critical point where linkages could be drawn to enhance the country's biodiversity planning as well, so that future climate change impacts are being considered while drawing up plans for biodiversity protection. Next slide, please. One of the great things that we noticed during this research is that all countries have included one or more concrete actions relating to protecting, conserving, restoring, and sustainably using and managing natural ecosystems. Most of these actions mentioned were about sustainable management, so things like forest management or water management, and then followed by restoration and conservation. So as you can see here, 52 countries out of the 57 reviewed mention sustainable management practices. 48 out of the 57 mention at least one restoration activities, and 40 for conservation. So some of the mentioned restoration activities were, of course, no surprise, forest restoration and mangrove restoration, the two most popular EBA measures, followed by wetland restoration. And for conservation, soil and water conservation were the top mentioned actions. Next slide, please. So just a couple slides ago, I briefly mentioned the point on synergy between climate adaptation and biodiversity actions. What we see in the NAP documents is that more and more countries are referencing the links between climate change and biodiversity loss. Climate change contributes to habitat loss and biodiversity degradation, while the loss of biodiversity and intact forests and marine ecosystems in turn exacerbate climate change. But even with this, fewer than half of the 57 countries we reviewed refer to their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan, or NBSAP for short. NBSAPs are like the NDC for biodiversity. Countries are required to submit one under the Convention on Biological Diversity, or CBD, and align their NBSAP with the latest goals and targets. In 2022, countries adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework as the successor for the old Aichi targets. So here, all of the 57 countries we reviewed in our analysis have an NBSAP in place, but only 47% of these NAP documents reference their NBSAP. Next slide, please. So what are some of the reflections coming from this report? What we found is that there is high awareness among governments that ecosystem and ecosystem services are significantly compromised by climate change. More NAPs are recognizing the significant role ecosystems can play in adaptation to build climate resilience. But at the same time, there are still gaps in terms of cross-referencing climate change plans with biodiversity policy instruments, such as the country's NBSAPs. Delivering NBS and EBA at scale And aligning a country's climate and biodiversity actions will help countries achieve the targets and goals set under both the Paris Agreement and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And with this, countries should pay more attention and build closer synergies between their biodiversity planning process and their NAP process, and invest in nature-based solution actions that contribute to achieving multiple objectives, including mitigation, and pay more attention to mountains, grassland, and urban ecosystems, as those were some of the ecosystems that we do not see a lot of mention of NBS actions in our review of the 57 NAPs. And a strong emphasis on sustainable management leaves room for NAP teams in different countries to expand protection and conservation measures, such as establishing and expanding protected areas, both terrestrial and marine protected areas, as a way to fulfill both climate and biodiversity commitments. Next slide, please. So here's a QR code for the report. Feel free to scan and download and read the full report, including our methodology and some more insights from our review. And thank you very much. Looking forward to the other panelists' presentation. I'm going to hand it back to you, Nicole.
Thank you very much for the great presentation and overview of the key findings, Jeffrey. We'll now be hearing from Andrea Greenidge on the government of Belize's experience with integrating EBA and NBS into their sectoral NAP. Andrea, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Warm greetings from Belize. And so, Belize is a small country located within Central America with a population of about 400,000. It's important to note that 40% of our population reside on our coasts. And given our mostly flat terrain, this makes us very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And so climate change has had significant impacts on Belize's territory, our population, and key economic sectors. Impacts experienced in the country to date include sustained droughts, floods, increase in coastal erosion, and changing precipitation patterns. Next slide, please. And so Belize is economically dependent on our coastal ecosystems and the ecosystem services we get from nature. The fishing industry plays a very big part of our Belizean society and our economy. It supports about more than 3,000 registered fishers and their families. It provides a source of protein for local consumption and export to foreign markets. So we know that we rely on these ecosystems for recreation, food security, ecosystem services, cultural heritage, and tourism. Next slide, please. And over the years, we've had several achievements within the coastal zone and fisheries sector. I will touch more on a project that we had in 2022, but since then, we have been prioritizing climate planning and resilience and have completed multiple vulnerability and livelihood assessments for key coastal communities in Belize. We've completed a climate change communication strategy and knowledge management plan, a sustainable fisheries value chain report, a gender assessment, an implementation plan, and many other studies and reports, and have done a series of stakeholder consultation sessions with the aim to feed these documents and important feedback from the consultation sessions into our national adaptation planning efforts. Next slide, please. And so, although we recognize the importance of maintaining the health and the integrity of our coastal ecosystems and have been making strides in prioritizing greater resilience, we understand that these benefits cannot be seen overnight. We know that, it is a process. And so over the years, these climate change impacts have taken a toll on Belize's physical and social infrastructure. Next slide, it's one little image I want to show. And so we know that we've been witnessing beach erosion, island erosion, increased hurricane intensity, and frequent flooding, coupled with the ever-growing demand for more coastal development to support the tourism sector. And so these factors create a concerning, unsustainable situation. Next slide, please. And so this is the project that I was talking about. In 2022, the government of Belize, through then the Ministry of Blue Economy and Civil Aviation, now we're the Ministry of Blue Economy and Disaster Risk Management, we had collaborated with the FAO and the Green Climate Fund to initiate a project called Enhancing Adaptation Planning and Increasing Climate Resilience in the Coastal Zone and Fisheries Sector. And so one significant outcome of this project was the development of a NAP for 2024-2034. Our NAP document currently outlines 28 adaptation strategies and 15 targeted outcomes. These strategies prioritize locally led adaptation, EBA, nature-based solution, and active private sector engagement. Next slide, please. And so while, as I mentioned, under this project, we had originally developed our national adaptation plan, um, we we are currently revising it or tweaking it as we wanted to incorporate um, more national plans and policies. And currently we're finalizing our NDC 3.0. I believe that should be finalized by the end of this week. But we want the document to be more aligned with national priorities. And so I also must thank the NAP Global Network for currently assisting Belize with this current revision. Their support thus far has been very invaluable. And the vision of the NAP is to strengthen and enhance climate resilience in Belize's coastal zone and fisheries sector by prioritizing adaptive capacity. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, while the document is still under revision, the government of Belize has been actively promoting nature-based solutions to protect, manage, and restore our critical ecosystems. Currently, we are, well, in our last NDC 2.0, we had pledged to protect an additional 12,000 hectares of mangroves and restore at least 4,000 hectares by 2030 to enhance coastal resilience. Currently, we are also strengthening collaborative efforts to conserve and restore mangrove habitats under our Belize Mangrove Alliance Action Plan. We're also working on our Belize National Coral Reef Restoration Action Plan, which will guide restoration efforts to enhance reef resilience and biodiversity. We're also, the Ministry of Blue Economy and in collaboration with other partners, is also leading the development of a national seagrass management policy for Belize. And in this policy, it will identify and prioritize seagrass areas for protection and possible restoration. And so all these initiatives will be integrated into Belize's NAP process. And so I also want to highlight that while EBAs and NBS is very important, that we also must prioritize the social welfare and climate resilience of key coastal communities. We know that we must strengthen insurance programs, pension plans, and compensation frameworks to support our fishers and their families facing these climate risks. And also, lastly, as some of you may know, Belize underwent a Depth for Nature swap, which was the largest Depth for Nature swap at the time. And so we restructured a portion of our national debt, and we have allocated approximately 180 million that will be invested over a 20-year period for marine conservation and development of our blue economy. And so under this commitment, we've pledged to expand our marine biodiversity protection zones from 15.9% to 30% by 2026. So we have a lot of work to do. And so these funds will be directed towards implementing ecosystem-based adaptation measures, including, as I mentioned earlier, the protection of coral reefs, mangroves, and other critical habitats, for mitigating climate change impacts and supporting our sustainable fisheries. So, in conclusion, through these initiatives, we've demonstrated a strong commitment to integrating ecosystem-based adaptation into our national strategies and national planning efforts. So by prioritizing our rich marine biodiversity and enhancing our resilience of coastal communities, we will continue to make strides in our sustainable marine conservation and climate adaptation efforts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrea, for sharing those insights from Belize and and congratulations on the really important work that you're doing. We'll next hear from Lou Perpez on the work that UN Environment Program is doing to support EBA in that processes. Lou, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I see the slides, please? So I'm Lou Perpez. I'm working for the United Nations Environment Program, and happy to be talking today about ideas and tips around how to integrate nature-based solutions, EBA, in NAP processes. Next slide, please. So in UNEP, if you don't know us yet, can we see the next slide, please? We are working mostly with developing countries to access international funding. And so we're working with about 50 countries and with grant investment of about 550 billion. So that's who we are. Next slide, please. So a bit of the basics of the NAP, so the National Adaptation Plans, as I'm sure many of you know from the chat, given your fields of expertise. So the UNFCCC has developed guidelines that explain a bit how to structure the NAP process. So they recommend to have 4 elements in the NAP. So the first one, laying the groundwork and addressing gaps, is really about knowing where you're working, basically, what is the country context, what are the key stakeholders, what is the legal landscape, etc. Then element B, the preparatory elements, is more about the scientific aspects. So making sure that you have climate scenarios, climate risk assessment, so all of these data points. Then that brings you to element C, which is implementation strategies. So how are you going to make sure that the NAP document that you develop is implementable? And finally, element D, so all of the aspects of reporting, monitoring, and review. So this is the 4 stages along which I'd like to give some ideas around how to integrate EBA. Next slide, please. So in the first, so the first 2 elements, A and B, are about formulating, so about drafting your NAP document, the National Adaptation Plan document, so really your strategy. So one first recommendation is really to make sure that you identify the key ecosystems and ecosystem services at play. So you want to know what is going to be affected by climate change. And when you do so, you may already have carried climate risk assessment. You also want to know what are the possible contributions that ecosystem can make to reduce the climate risk, and also what are the adaptation options to safeguard this ecosystem. So I'll give an example there in Malawi, for instance, where we are supporting the government to develop its NAP. What we did when we carried the climate risk assessment, so often you're going to have to select units, let's say, like special units to say, okay, where do you want to look at the climate risk assessment? And often it can be easy to go at the administrative units because that's logical. So looking at a district. But the issue with this thinking is then it's more about, you know, the history and the political background of the country rather than the ecosystems of the country. So in Malawi, what we did, we still went like to look at 8 districts, but we made sure that the 8 districts that we were selecting were representatives of the agroecological zones of the country. Because this way you can make sure that you really have an assessment of how is climate change going to impact your country in each of its ecosystems. And something else that we did that was quite helpful to really integrate this ecosystem lens in the climate risk assessment was to look at the water catchment area. So in most NAPs, I believe water is one of the priority sector. And if you want to look at the impacts of climate change in water, it's very helpful to look at those water catchment areas because then you can really assess, okay, what is so if you look at the lake, for instance, in Malawi, the Lake Malawi is one of the biggest lake in Africa and very important for the country aquifer restoration. So we really look at this area and to assess, okay, if there is deforestation there, if there is more settlements on that side, what is the impact on the resource? So that's really a way to go about it to make sure that you are integrating the ecosystems in your analysis. Once you have done that, you would be looking at the different plans that exist and see how can you, different plans that exist and also what are your targets in terms of EBA and how can you fit those EBA intervention into the targets that you have identified. Another tip is really to work on demonstrating the economic viability of the EBA measures. And there, one practice that we often do is to comparing the effectiveness of the EBA measure that sometimes we call the green measures and the gray measures that are usually more about infrastructure. And also making sure that you consider hybrid approaches. So for instance, one of the classical example is, you know, if you're like in Belize, the example that was given that your coastal line is extremely important to you and probably you have major infrastructure on that coast. So you may have major roads there. One of the classical solution, let's say, adaptation option is to build seawalls to limit the coastal erosion and to protect from the impact of the waves. And then if you want to integrate this ecosystem lens, one idea is to look, okay, well, if you were strengthening the corals in the region or adding mangroves, depending on which region of the world you are, this could actually bring like more longer term benefit and be quite complementary with the seawall that we are seeing in quite a few places where they built, they were not high enough and not made for the long-term impacts of climate change, unfortunately. So that's why you really want to know what is the cost of your options and of the different sets of options. Next slide, please. So this was all about the drafting of the NAP. Now, when we look at the element C, so the strategies that will help you implement your NAP, one very important bit is the climate finance strategy. So there you want to make sure that you are allocating funding to the EBA measures that you have identified and looking at all the different pools of funding. Then another suggestion is also really to integrate the priority EBA actions that you have identified into all the existing plans, because we know that there is the NAP, but there's always a development plan. There may be a sectoral plan for each of the ministries. And so it's really key to screen those plans and see, okay, where my EBA actions could fit within these existing plans. Another one is to look at the Sustainable Development Goals plans and all of the multilateral environment agreement plans. So that may be, for instance, we were talking earlier about the NBSAPs. So in those plans, you are very likely to have ecosystem-related activities. So screen those and really see where you can also have synergies. And then another recommendation is, of course, to make sure that you have the appropriate capacity in your country, and especially on the domain of EBA, that's relatively a new theme. We saw the graph earlier with the pickup of the term. And so it's recommended to really have those regular capacity strengthening, to make sure that EBA will be adequately integrating in your adaptation planning. Next slide, please. So this is about the last element, so the reviewing stage. And there we recommend to define indicators that enable the monitoring of the NAP priorities, and that in those indicators you also watch for the EBA elements. Another recommendation is also to develop this evidence of the cost effectiveness of EBA interventions. I was giving the example of the seawall with the mangroves or the corals, to monitor this and the cost. And maybe you have in your country different places where you went for different adaptation strategies. To monitor the effectiveness and the cost of those actions is extremely useful to then have more data that help you to have, your lesson learned. And those lessons, it's also key to make sure to pass it to the other sectors, to make sure that it doesn't stay with the Ministry of Environment, who is often the one leading. Make sure every sector hears about it and can integrate it into their operations. And finally, also use it for yourself, for your NAP documents, making sure that your EBA lesson learned inform the next cycle of your NAP and really have this reflective thinking, if I can say. Next slide, please. So all of those ideas and recommendations don't come from my mind, but from this report that we published, which is the guidelines for integrating EBA into NAPs. So if you want to have a look at it, there is the proper guidelines document. We also have an e-course. And recently, we also developed a new e-course to which you can see the picture there and also the QR code to scan it. And in this new e-course, what we've done, we've developed this interactive landscape where we really wanted people to be able to model, what is the impact of nature in big terms on your adaptation planning. And so it's a very nice tool, and I would encourage you to have a look at it. And if you can show the next slide, please, so I can show you what the landscape looks like. Yes, please, if you can show the 3 pictures, so you will be able to model what a flooding looks like, what the seawall looks like, etc., and have a bit more of, real pictures, and all of this is based on real data. So again, I encourage you to have a look at it. And next slide, please, which I think is for me to thank you and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Lou, for that presentation. We would now like to open up the conversation for questions from the audience. So please feel free to write your questions and comments in the chat box in English, Spanish, or French, and we'll share them with the panelists. And I believe Christian will be asking the first question.
Thanks very much, Nicole. So the first question is for Andrea. And Andrea, the question is on how the Belize sectoral NAP process for coastal zones and fisheries is addressing innovation. We know that EBA is just one tool in the toolbox for adaptation, and you already talked about how the NAP process is complementing EBA approaches with social considerations. So how are you also complementing EBA and the work to restore and conserve nature with innovation? Over to you,
Right.
Andrea.
Yes, thank you for that question. As a part of our blue economy policy priority, we have to look at capacity building and research and innovation within our entire blue economy. And so currently the ministry is working to develop a it's a long name. It's a blue economy community resilience and innovation hub that would essentially act as a mechanism to build skills and build capacity within local communities, NGOs, and the private sector. We know that there are many different sectors within our blue economy, and we know that while they are established sectors, they are emerging sectors such as seaweed farming and oyster farming. And so we want to also build these emerging sectors while also building capacity within our local communities. And so we want to engage more in sustainable seaweed farming practices, um, diversification of livelihoods, and improving blue business and innovation skills. So that is something that the ministry is currently working with, and will be by the time our NAP is finalized, this hub will already be launched. And so the initiatives under this hub will be incorporated within our national adaptation planning process.
That's great to hear, Andrew. We have our next question for Lou, and I know you touched on this a little bit about monitoring and the importance of indicators. We're just wondering, are there any examples that you can provide as to which indicators you can use to measure the effectiveness of EBA in NAPS?
Thank you. So the effectiveness of EBA in NAPS, I think that one idea would be you would have to narrow it down. So looking at what EBA action have you chosen? So for instance, let's say to promote agriculture in one area, you are going, you know that the area will suffer from a lack of rainfall, more droughts, etc. And one of your EBA solution is gonna be to promote agroforestry, a mix of different trees and cultures in that area to make sure that all the vegetation is helping to keep the water in the ground in the moments of drought. So a very simplified example, but let's say we're working with this. So then what you want to measure is to make sure that the places where you are planting the trees, are you then getting resilience of your crops? So there again, making sure you select a few crops, for instance, maize, let's say, and to monitor this over time. So your indicator would be to look at the tree coverage in that area and the crop yields over time, and comparing this in different regions where you have been implementing different solutions. I hope that helps to answer, but just to say it's always complicated and extremely local, but that's the thinking behind.
Great, thank you, Lou. Our next question is for Jeffrey. So Jeffrey, you spoke about the importance of synergy between NBSAPs and national adaptation plans, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and national adaptation plans. So can you tell us a bit more about what that looks like in practice? What do governments leading these two processes have to do to make these synergies happen? And what do you do with specific EBA actions that are relevant to both processes? Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the question as well. It's a lot of acronyms, NBSAP and NAPS and NDCs. But just want to kind of give two resources on in the beginning. So we did a guidance note, supplementary guidance, the NAP technical guidelines with the UNFCCC and GIZ on exactly how to align a country's NAP process with their NBSAP process. And I believe Adrian will be sharing those in the chat later. There is also another kind of shortened version of a checklist for countries trying to align their NDC, their NAP, and their NBSAP. So all three instruments together. So I think in short, what sort of countries are trying to do is to look across the different common planning elements. So we know for both NDC, for NAP, for NBSAP, there's always kind of this, laying out the groundwork and assessing what are the gaps, what are the climate risks, what are the emission information for this country, what are some of the kind of the vulnerabilities and risks associated with biodiversity loss. And look across these common elements and try to either combine the process or try to draw linkages between the process. So one of the example for this kind of assessment phase, for example, is while the NAP process is undertaking a climate risk and vulnerability assessment, any information related to climate change impacts on biodiversity or climate change vulnerability related to biodiversity loss could be then used in informing the country's NBSAT process while they're conducting their biodiversity assessment and national ecosystem assessments. So this kind of cross-referencing or this kind of linking the process together could help with efficiency, could help with conserving resources as well, but also making sure, from the very beginning that these documents are interlinked. So aside from this kind of assessment process, there's also goal setting. So one of the key things we learned from a workshop in Baku on this kind of checklist was countries need kind of high-level mandates and political buy-in to make sure these two processes are interlinked and synergized. There's also a need for kind of a national story, kind of a common goal across your NDC process, a common goal across your NAP and NBSAP process. So you have a common narrative on what you're trying to achieve in terms of sustainable development, in terms of climate action, in terms of biodiversity action. So kind of similarly with other steps as well, how to identify different strategies, policies, and activities. And that's where this identification and prioritization of different EBA or MBS measures comes in. You want to select an activity that not only will withstand the future impacts of climate change, but also help to contribute to multiple goals, whether it's mitigation goals, whether it's your biodiversity goals as well. And lastly, just want to mention kind of this joint financing and joint MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning of your EBA activities are also super important. And I think we see a lot of countries actually doing this, and multiple different kind of funds, the Green Climate Fund or other funds are also encouraging countries to do this as well. So I highly encourage to check out those two resources that Adrian has shared in the chat. Back to you, Christian. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeffrey. We have another question for Lou. So in terms of the EBA and NAP work, how do you go about coordinating inputs from various initiatives and stakeholders working in this space? And also, in making the case for NBS and EBA with numbers, how can you approach that? And then, as a kind of related question, has there been any focus on drainage and irrigation in your work and how NBS could be included in that as well?
Thank you for the question. So on the coordination of stakeholders, so I'd say it really depends on the countries. Each country has very different institutional coordination mechanism, and that's usually through those that we manage to coordinate the different stakeholders. In my experience, the civil society organizations are the ones calling the most for those synergies, because I think or the local population, because they see, the different projects coming, the different officers coming with different ideas and really want to see the coherence with all of that. So I'd say it's, work at the personal level, making sure that your project team is reaching out and being aware of everything that is going on, and also using all of the institutional coordination mechanisms. So in Malawi, again, there are 3 different levels. You have an expert working group on adaptation, then you have a steering committee, a technical committee, and that's how we make sure that all the different ministries are part of the process and know what's going on and how you can bring it together. Then how to make the case with numbers. So, I mean, that's the whole idea of appraising the different options and looking at the short, medium and long term of the options you're looking at, because maybe in the short term, one option may seem cheaper than the other, but it's in the long term and under different climate scenarios. And I thought there was a question about this in the chat to say, okay, we have quite a lot of unpredictability. We don't know, what the climate is going to look like. So we need to make plans for all the possible futures. And then it's a matter of national consultations to choose, okay, what options are you going with? What are the no regrets option? And this is a new field. And I can share, we've developed a few case studies on that to put a price on EBA and examples. And then drainage, irrigation. I'm sure that the organization works on this. Personally, I haven't, but it's something that comes up often in the climate impacts, just because of the increased risk of droughts, diminished rainfall. Then irrigation solution come in, and often one of the classic EBA solution, let's say, is going back to the trees I was talking about, making sure you have, shade. So you need to irrigate lace. And I can share also there, we have a project that is about creating gardens in the Sahara, actually, making sure that you use the crops that are resilient, etc. So let me share this in the chat if I manage.
Great, thank you so much, Lou. So we're just coming to the end of the QA sections. There are a few questions that we didn't get to, and so if any of the panelists have a moment to respond to those in the chat, we can also perhaps follow up after the webinar, and feel free to send us an email. But just to wrap up this Q&A period, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to please share one last key takeaway that you'd like those who've attended this webinar to come away with. So Jeffrey, I'll put you on the spot first. What's one key takeaway you'd like everyone who's joining us here today to know on EBA and NBS in NAP processes?
Sure, thanks. Sorry, I was trying to put an answer to the chat. But if there's one key takeaway, I think is countries are paying more attention. They have more awareness on EBA and NBS. And as we go to all those COPs and SB meetings at UNCCC or CBD COPs, more people are talking about ecosystem-based adaptation. But one of the key things about it is you have to make sure that EBA and NBS do deliver social and environmental good. So following a gender-responsive approach, following a socially inclusive approach, and making sure all the safeguards are in place to make sure to ensure ecosystem integrity, and also human rights are being respected while they're implemented. So that is a super important aspect. And if that aspect is not met, they're not NBS according to the global standard and according to the UN Environment Assembly definition. So that's one key takeaway. While there's more recognition, we also need to pay attention to those safeguards as well. Thanks.
Thanks. Thanks so much, Jeffrey. And Lou, same question. What's one key takeaway you'd like everyone here to come away with after this webinar? Thanks.
Thanks. I think I'll go back to this idea of how do you make sure that you have the ecosystem lens in your thinking and in your NAP process, because sometimes it can seem a bit complicated. What does it mean, like adopting EBA? What does it mean in practice? And what it comes to is really making sure that in your thinking, and the most critical stage is really in the climate risk assessment that you lead, that you don't only look at, the traditional sectors the way we always did it, but really look at the ecosystem dynamics in it. And it's a very simple task, but something to keep in mind when you are looking at the impacts of climate change. Just think, okay, what are the ecosystems there actually? Because we tend to forget that everything is underpinned on the ecosystems, and that's where we can really make progress, I believe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. And Andrea, over to you for the last word. What's one message you'd like everyone to come away with from Belize's experience?
Yes, I think that while science and data is very key to informing EBAs, that we must remember to prioritize local knowledge within coastal communities and ecosystems to inform models and overall adaptation strategies. So I'll keep it short, but that is what I believe, that we must prioritize traditional knowledge within ecosystem-based adaptation.
Thanks so much, Andrea. Nicole, I'll now pass to you to close the webinar.
Sounds good. Thanks, Christian. And thank you again to all our speakers. Just to let everyone know, we will be sharing the recording and the presentations shortly after and look forward to continuing this conversation. If you have any questions that we weren't able to cover today, please feel free to contact us at the email address for the NAP Global Network, which will be in the chat box shortly. And yeah, just a reminder that our new report on tracking progress on the integration of EBA and NBS in NAPS has now been published. The link is in the chat and was briefly on the screen in a QR code. So thank you again to everyone for attending, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.